Kristen Atchison here. Let's go over an example in Factorial Designs. Remember, Factorial Designs are designs that have more than one independent variable. So we have at least two independent variables, and the example that we're going to go through today has two independent variables, each with two levels, so we end up with four conditions. So the research example is from Kieson, Goldstein, and Savitsky in 2003. And the research questions were, do interrogators' expectations about a suspect's guilt or innocence influence the tactics they use? Okay, so does the interrogator, their predisposed assumption, does it affect kind of how they interrogate someone? The other question that they have was, do interrogators have confirmation bias, in which their initial beliefs about their guilt cause them to interrogate more aggressively? So are they trying to kind of confirm what they already thought? If they think that they're guilty, are they going to behave more aggressively in an attempt to get that guilty verdict? So the research design was a complex factorial design with two levels, and it was a 2x2 design. So they had one independent variable, which was interrogator expectation, and this was actually assigned, okay? So this was a true experiment. This was not looking at police interrogating suspects. This was a true experiment. And so interrogator expectation could be randomly assigned, and so it was in independent groups or between subject design, and the two levels were guilty expectation or innocent expectation. The other independent variable was suspect status. Again, this was an independent groups or between subjects factor that was randomly assigned in this true experiment. And there was two levels for that. You could be actually guilty or actually innocent. Okay, and students participated as interrogators or suspects in this laboratory mock crime. So again, this is a true experiment. Everything was randomly assigned. We have two different independent variables that we're looking at, and we have two different independent variables we're looking at, each of which that have two levels. So we'll end up having a 2x2 design or four different experimental conditions. The dependent variables, they measured a whole bunch in this study, but the ones that we're going to really look at include number of questions where kind of that guilt was there, that presumption of guilt was there. So instead of where were you during this time frame, what were you doing when you committed the crime? Those kinds of things, where they're saying, hey, or why did you commit the crime? That presumption of guilt is in that question. The number of persuasive interrogation techniques that they used, and the ratings of the amount of effort that went into obtain a confession. So there were multiple dependent variables, but these are the three that we're going to focus on. Again, we end up with four conditions. We have, in this 2x2 design, when we cross interrogator expectation with suspect status, the suspect that was actually guilty and the interrogator that thought they were guilty, we have interrogators were led to believe the suspect was guilty and the suspect actually committed the crime. We also have interrogators were led to believe the suspect was innocent and the suspect actually committed the crime. We have the suspect status level of actual innocence, where we have suspects were actually innocent and the interrogators were led to believe that they were guilty. And we have interrogators were led to believe that the suspect was innocent and the suspect did not commit the crime. So remember, a hypothesis is different than a research question. A hypothesis is kind of that predictive finding or the predictive answers to those questions. And again, these hypotheses aren't coming out of a vacuum. They're coming from somewhere. So their hypothesis was based on the literature surrounding behavioral confirmation theory. And what they believed was that interrogators would behave toward a suspect in ways that were consistent with their beliefs of whether they were guilty or innocent. And in turn, the suspects were predicted to respond in ways that support the interrogator's belief. Okay, so based on this line of theory and this line of literature, this is what they predicted to find. We're going to talk about the findings. Let's first review what a main effect is. Remember, a main effect is the effect of one independent variable. Here, that will be either suspect status or interrogator expectation, collapsing across the levels of the other one. So we'll look at suspect status all by itself, pretending that we didn't even look at interrogator expectation. And then we'll do it again, but we'll do it for interrogator expectation. And we'll totally ignore suspect status, pretending that we didn't even look at that. So again, it's looking at each independent variable by itself, under the idea that the other one didn't even happen. We've collapsed across that other independent variable, and now we're just looking at the two levels of suspect status or the two levels of interrogator expectation. Two main effects are possible for each dependent variable then, okay? We'll have the possible main effect of interrogator expectation, one of our independent variables, and the main effect of suspect status, the other independent variable. So we'll have for each independent variable, there's a main effect. And that's true of every dependent variable. Again, here they measured many dependent variables, so we could have multiple main effects. The studies that I'll give you on exams and the like are going to have one dependent variable. We're going to focus there. But for each independent variable, you can have a main effect for each one of them. So to look at the main effect of interrogator expectation, we're going to compare the guilty level and the innocent level, okay? And the dependent variable we're looking at here is the number of guilt presumptive questions. Okay, and remember how we did this is we collapsed across suspect status. So the numbers at the top, 3.54, 2.54, 3.7, 2.66 is the actual data of the number of guilt presumptive questions that were asked. But we're wanting to look at interrogator expectation all by itself. We don't want to look at suspect status. We don't want kind of that differentiation between actual guilt and actual innocence. We want to get rid of that. So the way we do that is an average or a mean. So we're going to take a mean, we're going to collapse across suspect status, and we're going to take a mean for guilty. So we're going to take 3.54 plus 3.7, average the two together, and we get 3.62. We're going to do the same thing for the innocent condition. 2.54 plus 2.66 divided by 2, average them together, and we get 2.6. And then to look at the main effect of interrogator expectation, the only numbers that we're going to look at is 3.62 versus 2.6. Again, your book likes to give you kind of a critical value for interpreting these. For just the sake of understanding differences, we're not going to get that kind of that statistical critical value kind of stuff into this until we get to statistics. For the research methods purposes, if the numbers are different, there's a main effect. So we have a little over a 1 point difference here. We're going to say that there may be a main effect here. We don't know if that main effect is statistically significant, but there is a difference, okay? So because 3.62 is larger than 2.6, we're able to say that there is likely a main effect of interrogator expectation. And again, this is how we did that math. We got the 3.62 by adding those two values and dividing. We averaged the same thing for innocent, and that's how we got the 2.6. Actually, they did a statistical test, and they revealed that these were statistically different. And the authors concluded that interrogators who suspected their suspect to be guilty chose more guilt presumptive questions, 3.62, than interrogators who expected an innocent suspect. So when they thought they were guilty, they asked more guilt presumptive questions. Notice that this main effect talks about both of the levels of interrogator expectation, and it compares them, and it says which one was greater, that there was a difference between them, and it describes that main effect. It doesn't just say that there is a main effect of interrogator expectation. It describes the effect, and it describes it that they asked more guilt presumptive questions when they were presumed guilty than when presumed innocent. Again, notice they've talked about both levels of the independent variable, and they've talked about the dependent variable. If you just say that it was higher with guilt presumptive, it was higher with guilty than innocent, that doesn't tell me anything because you're not telling me what it was higher on. That important piece, that guilt presumptive questions, that dependent variable needs to be mentioned as well. So in a description of a main effect, you need to talk about each level of that independent variable, and you need to talk about the dependent variable as well. So let's move on to suspect status. The same thing. The dependent variable here is number of persuasive techniques. Now, when we're looking at suspect status, we want to pretend that interrogator expectation didn't happen. We want to ignore that, okay? We want to collapse across interrogator expectation. We don't care about the two numbers 7.71 and 6.59. What we care about is collapsing across that and getting one number for actual guilt. And again, how we'll do that is we'll average. The same thing for actual innocence. We'll do marginal means, and we'll get 11.42. And again, here we have a difference. 7.15 is less than 11.42. So we're able to say that there's likely a main effect here. So again, this is how we got those values. We averaged each of them. We collapsed across the levels of interrogator expectation and just looked at suspect status. Again, the researchers found that these were statistically significant. Interrogators who interviewed a suspect who was actually innocent, so we're talking about one level of suspect status, used more persuasive techniques, that's the dependent variable, and then it gives us the mean, than interrogators who interviewed a suspect who was actually guilty, the second level of the independent variable. Again, both levels of the independent variable are discussed and in terms of the dependent variable. So we've described that effect. So when you're asked to describe a main effect, this is what you're asked to do. Remember, your book gives you that nice kind of fill in the blank. There is a main effect of in suspect status such that when they thought they were actually innocent, they used more persuasive techniques than when they were actually guilty. Again, we talked about both levels of the independent variable, and we talked about the dependent variable. And again, remember, it's not everybody's sentence isn't going to be the same. I'm not expecting everybody's sentence to be the same. What's important is that you're describing those directions of those effects, and that you're talking about both levels of the all the levels of the independent variable. If there's 3 levels, you'll talk about all 3 levels of those, and you're talking about in terms of that dependent variable. So when we're looking at factorial designs, it's important to remember that there's usually 3 things we're looking for. If our factorial design is a 2-factor design, then the 2 of the 3 things are 2 main effects, a main effect for each independent variable. The third thing is that interaction effect. And remember, interactions can only be looked at in factorial designs. So this is really an asset of factorial designs because it allows us to look at these things simultaneously. So interaction effects occur when the effect of one independent variable varies or differs depending on the second independent variable. So again, these two are interacting with each other to cause changes or differences on the dependent variable. It's not one thing operating by itself. These things are working together and working differently. We're producing different results together than they do alone. So in the Casson study, they looked at the effect of suspect status, the 2 levels, actual guilt versus actual innocent, at each level of the interrogator expectation. You could flip that. You could look at the effect of interrogator expectation at each level of suspect status. It really doesn't matter which direction you're looking at, but we're looking to see if we're seeing the same things that we saw for actual guilt versus innocence at each level of interrogator expectation that we did when we collapsed across interrogator expectation. So one way that we do this, and the way that I talk about doing it, is the subtraction method. Now your book talks about a slightly different way. Either way is fine. I don't care how you come up with it, but this is one of the ways that works, and this is the way that I really like the best. So this is the way that I kind of push is the subtraction method. So basically what you do is you have these marginal means. You've already done these marginal means when you're looking at main effects and interactions. So they're already there. Okay, and you say, okay, well, what's the difference between these marginal means? Well, here our difference is 0.7, okay? And what if we don't have an interaction, then that 0.7 difference between guilty versus innocent should be seen at each level of suspect status, okay? Remember, we're going to look at the guilty versus innocent and see if that main effect holds up for each level of suspect status, okay? So here we have 0.7. Well, the question is the difference between 7.17 and 5.85 0.7? No, it's not, right? So we don't have that same difference. How about 5.64 versus 5.56? No, right? That's not 0.7 either. So neither one of those has something different is going on at each level of suspect status than was going on when we collapsed across suspect status. Okay, so something different is going on. And this tells us that an interaction is really likely. Again, we need a statistical test to really confirm this, but it looks like, given this, that there is an interaction. We need to explain this data the same way and describe this interaction just like we have with our main effects. And one way to do this is just using main effects, okay? So when suspects were actually guilty, the effort to obtain a confession was not affected by interrogator expectation, innocent or guilty, right? And so it talks about the two difference. That's the first part of this describing this interaction because there was no difference there, right? 5.56 and 5.64 are essentially the same. However, and again, this is a good point in an interaction statement. There's some sort of caveat statement that's saying that something different is going on at one level versus the other level. That could be however, that could be but, that could be although, it could be a semicolon, something that's just really creating this juxtaposition between the two that's saying something different is going on in this level of the independent variable than that's going on in this level of the independent variable. And that's what we see here. So there wasn't a difference for actually guilty. However, there was a difference for actually innocent in interrogator expectation. When the suspect was actually innocent, the interrogator expected a guilty suspect. They put more effort into obtaining that confession than when the interrogator expected an innocent suspect. So again, we saw something different going on with effort to obtain a confession when we cross these two levels of the independent variable. And again, this ended up being a statistically significant difference. So again, one way to do this is we can kind of just juxtapose the two. What's really important, there's not a formula for an interaction like there was for main effects. So you really are going to have to look at it and kind of piece together what's going on. The things that you want to make sure, there is a checklist though, the things that you want to make sure that you have is that you're talking again about the dependent variable, because obviously that's really important, what was changed. And you need to make sure that you're talking about all four conditions or all of the conditions. In this case, there was 4 conditions, and showing that juxtaposition in some way. So showing that juxtaposition with some sort of caveat statement. So however, but, again, a semicolon could work. Something that's putting these two things opposed from each other. And again, you see they both talk about the dependent variable and they talk about all 4 levels of the independent, all 4 conditions of both independent variables when they cross. So we have the 5.56, the 5.64, the 7.17, and the 5.85. So basically what this is saying is that, again, interrogators differed in their effort to obtain a confession depending on their expectations and whether the suspect was actually guilty or innocent. This is telling us that there's an interaction between both the suspect's status and the interrogator expectation independent variables. The effect of one independent variable differed depending on the level of the second independent variable. And again, that's the definition of an interaction effect, that something different is going on when we look at these things together than when we looked at them by themselves. A really great way, again, and we've talked about this previously, to really look at this is a graph or a figure to see these interaction effects really, really easily. The subtraction method works great, but it's a lot easier and a lot quicker often to see these with a graph or a figure. So we can see this when the lines are not parallel. Doesn't matter how the lines are not parallel, just that they're not parallel, okay? So that we can have these lines intersecting, we can have these lines converging, so these lines getting closer together, we can have these lines diverging, getting further apart, anything other than parallel, and it really is, an interaction is likely to be there, okay? Just like with anything else we've talked about, you're going to have to do a statistical test to confirm whether that's statistically significant, but again, it's telling us that there's likely something else going on. So here's our graph for the data I just showed you on the interaction. So the ratings to obtain the effort to obtain a confession. We have the blue straight line is actual guilt, and we have the dotted kind of reddish mauvish line is actual innocence. And what we see is that really on interrogator expectation, there's no difference in actual innocence, right? However, when we look at actual innocence versus actual guilt, there is a difference. We see an increase attempt at a effort to obtain a confession when the interrogator expected a guilty suspect and they actually had an innocent one. So we see something different going on for that group than we saw for the others. Again, you can see that here because these lines are converging. They're getting closer together. They start further apart and they get closer together. Anything other than parallel, again, indicates this. An interaction effect is not present. When it's not present or statistically significant, we can really generalize those findings across the condition. So we can generalize the findings of our main effects, okay? So we have a lot of external validity when we do not have an interaction effect, okay? An example of this from the Casson study is for the number of persuasive techniques used, it was not a statistically significant interaction. So we can take those main effects and we can generalize them for all conditions because nothing else is going on, right? There's not an interaction. However, when we do so example would be interrogators use more persuasive tactics when the suspect was actually innocent than when they were actually guilty. And this was true in both the guilty expectation condition and the innocent expectation condition. So again, we're able to generalize this between the two. And we're able to generalize this because there's not that interaction between them. If there was an interaction going on between suspect status and interrogator expectation, then it wouldn't be true at both levels. So again, because we'd have something different going on. So with this main effect, without an interaction, we're able to generalize those findings to both of the other levels. It's kind of thinking about it as the opposite because there is no interaction. Nothing different is going on at the two other levels. So the presence of an interaction, when it's statistically significant, really limits the external validity of our main effects. So when we found that interaction for the number of persuasive tactics, not all interrogators who expected a suspect to be guilty exerted a high degree of effort. We can't generalize those findings because we only found that high degree of effort in that one condition when we crossed actual innocence with perceived guilt. That was the only situation that we found a high level of effort. Other than that, the effort was pretty much the same. So because that interaction, we can't make these kind of blanket, externally valid statements about the effort received to obtain a confession because it was only true when these two independent variables interacted. So we won't be able to make a blanket statement about suspect status on that dependent variable. We won't be able to make a kind of a generalized finding about interrogator expectation on that dependent variable because we have an interaction. So basically what an interaction does is it sort of trumps those main effects for that dependent variable. So the number of persuasive tactics depends both on suspect status and interrogator expectations. So because it's depending on both of these, we can't make these blanket statements about one or the other, okay? So when you have a statistically significant interaction or when we have a likely interaction, that really affects the external validity that we have for these main effects, okay? So again, kind of think of it as a hierarchy. When we get a statistically significant interaction, that's going to trump those kind of main effects. We won't be able to generalize those main effects because something else is going on. So that kind of sums up this example of Kaysen. We will finish up in our next meeting as well and kind of finish up on factorial design. See you in class.